Today we're talking about plant styling. I'm going to give you some tips on how to make your plants look as nice as possible and how to use your plants to decorate your apartment. Hey everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. 5 years ago I started my plant hobby in an attempt to decorate my apartments with living artworks. 5 years into the journey, this whole growing plants thing has turned into so much more than just an aesthetically pleasing hobby. But aesthetics is always at the forefront of everything I do with my plants. My goal is to grow these plants as beautiful, lush and large as possible to decorate my apartment with, to create a nice urban jungle. And in today's video I want to pass on some tips and tricks that help you decorate your apartment with your plants as well. Now, of course, when it comes to aesthetics, we all have different opinions. We all have a different way of decorating. We all have a different personal preference. So, of course, this video is heavily biased based on my aesthetic preference, but hopefully some of the tips and tricks I can give you can be applied to your journey irrespective of the aesthetic preference that you have. Now, the first thing when it comes to plant styling is, of course, the plant in itself. A nice, healthy looking plant is always going to look better than a sick looking plant. So choose a plant that you can grow happy and healthy given the conditions and the time that you have available. You might find a plant online that really tickles your fancy in theory. You might really like the look of this plant in the way that it looks online. For example, Philodendron verrucosum. My personal favorite and very heavily based on the aesthetics of that plant. I love the shiny fronds, the velvet texture, I love the red backs, I love the fuzzy petioles, I love the electric veining. So from an aesthetics perspective, Philodendron verrucosum was one of the first plants that I really enjoyed, that really kickstarted this hobby for me as well. But it can be quite hard to grow a nice looking Philodendron verrucosum. They require quite a lot of maintenance, they're absolute pest magnets, and they also require high humidity. So from what I've seen online, Philodendron verrucosum isn't always a plant that grows really nicely when you grow it indoors. So even if that species technically ticks all of your boxes when it comes to the aesthetic preferences, you might not actually be able to grow it really nicely in your apartment given how tricky it is to grow. So in my opinion, choosing a plant that has a good time growing in your apartment and grows to its full potential or nearly its full potential would make a better plant to decorate your apartment with than a plant that you might like in theory but you can't ever actually realize. I rather look at a thriving plant that is just green than a half-dead velvet philodendron. So first and foremost, choose plants that suit your conditions in the first place. It will make your life as a grower much easier, but it will always look better as well if the plant is actually healthy. Now, of course, you can also compensate your conditions to suit the plants that you have chosen to grow. But if you're really new to this hobby, I think this is probably something you should do later on. Initially, I would always choose plants that suit the conditions that you've got available in the first place. Now, of course, I don't know what conditions you've got available because everybody has different conditions, but I think a pothos, for example, is a pretty safe option, and I personally think pothos are great looking plants as well to decorate your apartment with. All of the next tips that I'm going to give you really only make sense if you apply it to a plant that is already looking nice and is already having a good time and is healthy. Now, of course, I also have some plants that aren't so healthy. I actually have upstairs like a little storage area with a skylight, and all of my plants that are kind of recovering from either a chop or having had some pests or aren't looking their greatest just go over there until they look nice again and they get a prime spot in my actual living area. Now, of course, sometimes it takes a little while for the plant to actually grow nice and large and healthy for you to actually decorate it with. So there's going to be some sort of long-term vision over here. All of my plants started off as really small cuttings and then I grew them large. This monstera over here, well, same as the Thai, they're both about 3 to 4 years old. So of course, when I first bought them, they weren't like big enough to really make a large statement piece, but I had a long-term vision, and as part of that long-term vision, my plants are also used to my conditions, my way of caring for them, so they grew up in these conditions and thus are healthy and happy in my conditions. So that first tip, you know, might take a few months or even years to really realize, but at the end of the day, if you manage to grow your plants happy and healthy, that will always give you the best basis to then start decorating with them. Now my second tip is the position that the plant is in, and that position needs to be a compromise between what you like from an aesthetic perspective and what the plant likes from a growth perspective. When I go and visit a non-planty friend, let's say, you know, usually everybody has like 1 or 2 plants or something like that, right? I sometimes see, for example, a cute little succulent display in their windowless bathroom, or like a nice Monstera Deliciosa that they bought from the nursery like last week, and they put it in their hallway that is so far away from any sort of light. Just because, well, the corner looked empty, would appreciate a nice little green pop over here and so on, because it was a nice spot for us humans to look at the plant. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good spot for the plant to grow in. So it's really just gonna be a matter of time until the plant is going to either die in that spot or grow really, really disappointingly, right? So it might grow really leggy internodal spacing because it's looking for light. It might grow really long petioles with really small leaves. It might not grow at all. It might just die pretty quickly depending on the plant. But at the end of the day, it's very closely related to tip number 1. If you're not giving the plant the spot that it actually wants, then it's not actually going to grow. So it's then not going to look good, and it's not going to enable you to decorate your apartment with these plants. So find a spot that the plant likes, but you are also happy with looking at the plant in that spot. I try and use as much natural light as possible, so I've got these big windows to my right over here, and I try and have some of these plants in that window so they can take advantage of the natural light, but also I have chosen plants that aren't super tall, so they're not blocking the whole window and not blocking all of the light from traveling further into the room, and not closing off that indoor-outdoor sort of atmosphere, right? So I've chosen plants that are a little bit shorter. So the plants will like it in their position, but I also like looking at the plant, and I don't feel like I'm blocking the whole view, if that makes sense. I do have a lot of dark corners in my apartment as well, and I want to fill them with plants, but I just unlock those corners by providing a grow light. So then it doesn't really matter how much natural light the plant would get in that area, the grow light is going to facilitate the growth instead. I have a lot of plants that would 100% die if I would not provide them with supplemental light via a grow light, purely based on the position within my apartment that I have chosen to put this plant in. So make sure you compromise. First and foremost, you got to compromise on light. So make sure that you give that plant a spot where it gets sufficient light, but you're still happy looking at that plant in that spot. And that spot might also change throughout the seasons, by the way. As the light moves and the light exposure within your apartment moves, a spot that might have been really suitable for the plant in winter might not be suitable for the plant in summer, because it might be getting too hot or too much sun, or vice versa, right? So keep that in mind and pay attention to your plant. Look at the plant. Is it growing nice leaves? Are the leaves looking healthy? Are the leaves increasing in leaf size or not? And if that's not the case, then change the position. If the plant is not growing, decreasing in leaf size, leggy growth are all usual signs of insufficient light. So move it closer to a window or supplement via grow lights. So we really got the basics out of the way. We got our plants, we grew it nice and healthy, and we're putting it in a spot that enables the plant to continuously grow nice and healthy. Now we can really refine our styling a little bit. And my first tip is less is more. I definitely go for quality over quantity these days. And I know some people will say, hang on, don't you have hundreds of plants? And yes, I do. A lot of the times when people come to my house, they're actually not shocked. Shocked is maybe the wrong word, but they're surprised that I don't actually have that many plants indoors. When you really count them, there aren't that many plants, but each plant in itself is almost like a furniture item. It's definitely a bit of a statement piece. It's nice and large. It makes an impact. And I personally find that a much more aesthetically pleasing display, right? I rather look at 2 or 3 really nice large plants that are growing to their full potential rather than a shelf with 100 pots of like one-leafed plants, right? Again, aesthetic preferences are different, but keep that in mind, especially at the beginning of your plant journey while the plants aren't super large yet. It's often easy to get carried away and just want to acquire another plant and another one and another one. Again, have this long-term vision. What if all of these plants actually grow up to be really nice and large? Where are they all gonna go? And aren't they kind of stealing each other's thunder a little bit? Sometimes less is more, and focus on those few plants that you've got and really optimize their position, their light exposure, their growth, their care requirements and so on, and try and get the best out of those plants rather than spreading yourself too thin. And not just yourself, spreading the good spots in your apartment too thin. I constantly need to prioritize. I have way more plants than good spots available in my apartment, so I really need to prioritize which plants do I want to see thrive to their full potential. Which plants aren't so important and can take the back seat? Well, you know what? The backseat plants don't really need to be here. A lot of these backseat plants are because, well, I also do this as a job. I need to have plants to create content. If I would not be creating content with my plants, I would probably cull quite a few of my plants and really just focus on those few that I know really like my apartment and really make an impact in my apartment. So less is more, which also very much reduces the work and effort that you have to put in, and it's easier on your wallet. However, there's one time where I think that more is more, and that's when it comes to creating a lush pole. My Philodendron micans, for example, or my Adansonii, or my Philodendron verrucosum that I mentioned earlier, they're all multi-planted. Sometimes I have up to 10 or 12 cuttings on one moss pole, letting them all grow up that moss pole. That way, I can create a really nice lush display with the goal of really hiding the moss pole in itself. At the end of the day, I just want to see leaves. And sometimes if you just grow one plant up a moss pole, especially if that plant has lots of internodal spacing, it can look a little bit empty, it can look a little bit leggy, it can look a bit weird. Especially over time, you'll end up with lots and lots of propagations anyway, and I love to just chuck them back into the pot and have more vines growing up the same moss pole. That way, they don't take up any more space. I'm still following my less is more advice that I gave you earlier, but on each pole, sometimes more is more, if you know what I mean. So to create a nice lush display, I recommend adding at least 3 cuttings, sometimes even 4 or 5, because realistically, all of these cuttings are also going to grow in different speeds. So by the time you have to do an extension, or do you have a chop and extend, not all vines might actually make it onto the extension and then eventually will be kind of discarded as part of the chop and extend. So even if you start with, let's say, 10 cuttings on a pole, by the time you do a chop and extend, you might only end up with 5 that actually made it to the extension. So I don't think you really can overplant a moss pole, because natural selection is just going to take care of that, if it makes sense. But of course, consider the size of the pot and consider the size of the pole when you add a lot of cuttings to that pole, because, well, you know, where are all of the roots going to go? But of course, it also really depends on what kind of plant you want to grow. For example, I also have my Philodendron glorious or my Philodendron splendid. In themselves, they're really lush plants. They don't have huge internodal spacing, they have huge leaves. So with those, I just stuck to having one plant on a pole, because that one plant is already a showstopper, if that makes sense. I don't need to compensate with volume. Talking about Philodendron glorious, Philodendron splendid, one thing that they've got in common is that they have really, really long petioles, which can become a bit of an issue when it comes to creating nice displays using these plants, because the plants just spread in all sorts of directions. So I use a piece of twine to manage these petioles and kind of tie them together and tie them to the moss pole, so I can create a nice looking lush display. It's also space efficient, so I also enable more plants to fit in my small space, if that makes sense. Let's take the example of this one over here, the Cuprea. I always get a lot of comments about the Cuprea, and what I've done over here is I have a garden stake over here, and then every single petiole is tied to that garden stake or tied to each other. And that way I was able to create a really nice kind of lush display for this plant without the plant taking up the entire room. It also helps these petioles being really droopy, right? Especially alocasias are sometimes known to have really droopy petioles. Whoop, I just lift them back up. So this is something I do a lot with either plants that have really long petioles that take up too much space, or plants that can get a little bit droopy or kind of unruly. Of course, a plant like this you can also kind of rotate so that the plant grows evenly on all sides, but it still won't necessarily make the plant compact. Of course, you can use other things but twine. Twine is nice and organic. I personally like the look of it. It doesn't look too bad. You could use fishing wire that is see-through, but be careful, it's really thin and sharp. It could kind of hurt the petioles. You could use a wire, again, make sure that it's kind of thick enough to not kind of just cut into the petioles and so on. But at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong over here. I know that a lot of people like to just let their plants grow wild and they prefer that aesthetic. That's not my aesthetic preference. I'm very much as I like to grow these plants as close as possible to nature, I'm very much aware that this is quite far away from nature. We're growing them in an indoor setting. There's one sitting next to my couch on a table in a pot, you know, so we're already quite far away from nature, so I don't mind tying the plant up a little bit, if that makes sense, but you don't have to. It's just my tip, right? Not everybody might have that preference. Now, of course, the tying up can help creating a nice display site, but ideally the plant would grow with a nice display site in the first place, and there's a couple of things that I do for that. First things first, light. Now, light exposure obviously sets the potential for the plant to grow, but the positioning of the light also will dictate in which way the plant is growing. So I always like to position my plants strategically, taking into consideration how the light hits this plant. We've got the window over here and the light is coming from the front. So I know that the plant will want to face the front of this window, which is obviously not ideal if I look at it from the inside, because I'll basically just see the back of the plant. So for this window, I have chosen plants that have grown 360 around the pole, like this El Salvador over here, or 360 without a pole, like this alocasia. So I can actually rotate it, and a part of the plant will always face the light and it will grow nicely and so on, but I also get to see something at the same time. If, however, I have a plant sitting up against a wall, then obviously I want all of the leaves to just face into the room and not against the wall. What's the point, right? First of all, we take up way more space, but second of all, the wall doesn't have eyes. The wall doesn't care if the leaf is facing the wall or not. It's up against the wall. It's probably not also right in front of a window, most likely. So I often take my plants quite far away from the windows because I want to see the front of the plant, not the back of the plant, and then supplement with grow lights accordingly. I specifically like the mother grow lights because they have a vertical exposure. So the vertical exposure of the grow lights matches the vertical growth of my plants on moss poles. So all of the leaves are facing forward rather than facing upwards. If the light would come from above, the leaves would all face upwards rather than forwards, right? Let me insert this clip over here of my Adansonii, I think it's Indonesian form. I then moved it into the greenhouse when I moved here, and because of the greenhouse having light exposure from all sides, specifically also from the back, this plant doesn't really have a nice display site anymore, so it's kind of all over the shop. Alrighty, and we're back. It's been 1 month since the last video, and this is not necessarily an update to show you any like really impressive growth or anything like that. I just purely want to show you how this plant has changed the way that it's facing. They're all facing your way now because it is actually right here normally with the window where you are. Now, the other really obvious example is my entire wall of velvet philodendrons in my office, right? They are not really getting any natural light, they're just supported by the mother lights, and because the mother lights have this vertical exposure with light coming from the front, all of the leaves are also facing the front, giving me this really beautiful display side. So the light positioning is really, really important because leaves will face the light, but obviously also the light intensity, because that sets the potential in the first place. The other thing I do, and I don't always do that, to create a nice display site is using the pole in itself. This one is my philodendron ring of fire, and not many people actually grow it on a moss pole. It's more like a clumpy plant that grows in like a cluster. But as a result of it growing in the cluster, it also spreads 360 degrees, right? Which sometimes, depending on the positioning that you've got it in, might be what you want. That might be exactly what you want. You want a really nice, lush plant that fills a large space. Hey, you really want to squeeze in there, didn't you? I, however, am struggling with space, so I did not want that to happen. So what I've done with this plant is I've given it a moss pole, and you can see it has climbed up that moss pole, right? It's climbed up to here by now. So it is definitely climbing. Now, I've given it one of these half moon moss poles, so these D-shaped moss poles, and basically because the pole is on one side of the plant, all of the leaves, all of the petioles will automatically be pushed forward. So now if you look at this plant is actually only spreading 180 degrees rather than 360 degrees. So I can now put that up against a wall. So this doesn't take up much vertical space. So I could have another pole right behind it without this impacting anything, because it's not growing in all directions. Now, it's obviously not a space efficient plant, but I'm making it as space efficient as possible. But first and foremost, I'm creating one nice display site. All of the leaves are on one side. If I would grow this 360 degrees, there would only be half as many leaves on the display side that we all get to see. Nobody gets to see the back anyway. So why would I waste half of the leaves facing backwards? Talking about backwards, Bradley, you're just showing your bum today, huh? Yeah. Come on, sit down then. So yeah, why would I waste all of these leaves pointing backwards if nobody gets to see them? So that's something I consider at very early stages. When I first put the plant on the moss pole, I consider what is the growth pattern of this plant, and can I potentially put it on a pole not just for climbing purposes, but for aesthetic purposes. Kind of starting the plant styling at the very beginning and then letting the plant grow in line with your aims, you know what I mean? Rather than letting the plant grow and then trying to kind of tie up the plant and style it in hindsight. It's much easier to grow the plant in line with your preference. Alright, now those were all tips that kind of you apply to each plant individually, and you just kind of create a nice display out of each plant. But then once we have a few nice plants, we can create nice displays with these plants. The next tip would be to create nice arrangements using multiple plants. I like to use the rule of threes, or in general, odd numbers. I think 3 is good, 5 is good, 7 is maybe a little bit too much, but in general I think odd numbers, displays of odd numbers always works really well, specifically the rule of threes. Now when I put these together, I like to also mix different colors, different textures, different shapes and so on. Now the plants are obviously great and they are the main star of the show, but I also like to put all of my plants in decorative planters. Now the decorative planters are first and foremost functional. I like to use see-through pots. So with the see-through pots I can spy on the roots, but roots seek darkness. Not all of them. They are semi-epiphytes that grow up on trees. They don't necessarily need darkness, yada yada yada, but rule of thumb, usually roots seek darkness. So putting the see-through pot in a planter provides the pot with the darkness that the roots will appreciate, but first and foremost, it bloody looks good. Now obviously there's also some benefits from a drainage perspective, protecting your floors from potential water draining out of them and so on. So there's definitely some functionality to those, but I often just really like to use it as a decorative piece. There are a lot of really funky planters out there, but my personal preference is keeping all of the decorative planters really plain. I like to use white, black and grey, sometimes green, but most of the time I keep them very neutral. I like to keep them really simple and really just let the plant shine. I don't want the pot to take away from the plant's beauty. I just want the pot to give the plant like a plain canvas to really shine on, if that makes sense. And at the same time, if I stick to a certain theme of planters, I can mix and match them around as I repot plants, as they need to be up potted and change in size and so on. I can very easily mix and match these pots and I never have to worry about any of them clashing. Talking about plain and simple, I follow the exact same rule when it comes to furniture. Most of my furniture is just white. No fancy anything. I really just want my furniture to be, well, obviously functional, but again, I want my apartment, despite the fact that I'm a renter and I can't actually paint any of the walls, I like my walls to be white or at least monochrome. I like wooden floors, very simple. I don't like rugs with really crazy patterns. I like it to be as simple as possible so that really the artwork's gonna grab your attention. When you walk into a room, I want your eyes to be drawn to my plants, not to my furniture. I put so much effort into growing these plants, I want them to be the star of the show. So I like to stick to really, really basic furniture. Also, usually plain furniture is more cost effective. So I have a lot of just really plain IKEA or Kmart furniture, for example, specifically when it comes to shelving, because at the end of the day, these plant shelves aren't always in use as well. I go through phases, right? So for example, when my plants were all a bit smaller, I had them all up on shelves to elevate them a little bit and make them, well, get them closer to eye height. As my plants get larger and larger, I actually had to take them off the shelving because they were reaching the ceiling. So now most of my plants that are like mature, like these ones around me, they're on the ground. Now I have these 3-4 spare shelves. Every now and then they come into play again, depending on the setup. When I move and I have a different house with different challenges and different setups, then the shelf comes back into use. Sometimes I redecorate based on the seasons. So for example, this table over here, I'll use in winter because I get nice light over here. In summer, I don't get too much light actually coming into the room, so I will not use this table and I will probably change the plant that's here as well, right? So I keep changing the setup, and the furniture is really just enabling me to change the setup. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of money on really expensive items of furniture that I'm not too sure of if I will use them forever. Now, of course, like things like couches and so on is a bit different. I'm more specifically talking about furniture for your plants, like plant shelves and so on. Your plants will eventually outgrow them, so I wouldn't go all out spending a whole lot of money on like a super fancy shelf that potentially could just get damaged by water as well, right? Like, I mean, plants and water go hand in hand. Come here. And yeah, I have experienced a lot of water damage on some of my shelves. So I'm glad I just went for more basic IKEA options. But besides the fact that it's just better for my wallet, my main incentive behind choosing plain furniture was really creating this empty canvas for my plants to then kind of shine. Yeah, and those are really all of my tips. Now, of course, I don't follow all of them at all times with all of my plants in all of my rooms. You know, it really depends on the state of the plants at the moment, which plants are looking good, which plants are large. Sometimes I suddenly had to do 3-4 chop and extends with my plants, and I feel like it looks really empty, or like all of the plants have just reached the top of the moss pole and it's really challenging. Plants grow, plants change. As a result of that, the space that they need, the way that they look, all of that changes. So it's a constant redecorating, a constant adjusting and looking which plant looks good whereabouts, in which decorative pot, how can I group them together to make them look good, what grow light should I give them to, first of all, enable them to grow, but also which grow light is the most suitable for that plant to create a nice display site. Should the grow light come from above to create a nice lush display like with an oxalis, or should the light come from the front to create this nice display site for my moss poles? So it's a constant work in progress. It's not like one day you styled your apartment with plants and then that's it, because they're organic and they keep growing and they keep changing. you kind of just constantly have to adjust. And that's one of the most beautiful parts about it. I've lived in 4 different apartments while having this hobby, and of course I bring all of my plants with me, but each apartment looks different. Even within each apartment, every season in that apartment look different because I use different furniture, I have different setups, my plants look different. A different plant gets a prime spot to really shine and like grab your attention and so on. And I love that. I was that kid that like put up different posters on a weekly basis in his child's bedroom because I like change. I love mixing things up. I'm that person that, you know, changes the bed to a different wall in their room and wakes up thinking like, oh my god, I'm in like a hotel, this looks so different, you know what I mean? I always loved that as a child, and now I'm really living my fantasy through redecorating with my plants all the time, assessing whether I like it, assessing whether the plants like it, adjust and so on. It just keeps this hobby fun and interesting, and it's also sometimes really therapeutic for me. I try and film as much as possible, but sometimes I also just like to keep the camera off, put on some good music and just move plants around, look at them, see if I like it, look at it again, give it a night to think about it, change it around and so on. That is really fun to me, has always been fun to me. So yeah, I suppose that's why I started this hobby in the first place, because I had this aesthetic vision behind it. But you know, we all grow plants for different reasons. I understand if this is way too much effort for somebody else. I understand that some people prefer a more organic, wild look and they just want the plants to do their thing and they just accept them for what they are, but that's not very me. So yeah. Anyway, I hope that was useful and or entertaining for you, and I hope you got some value out of it. I would appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up, leave a nice comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. And I'll see you, or we'll see you next time. Bye!